Thank you. Just today I was talking about scientism in general, and even if you didn't hear that lecture, I think it's going to be quite possible to follow this one anyway, and I will just try to approach it from a slightly different angle, bring in the humanities perhaps a little bit more, but also bring in something else that I think is extremely important, what I and others have called the everyday life world. The definition of philosophy that Wilfrid Sellers has given is perhaps one of the most interesting ones. He says that philosophy is about how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest sense of the term. Well, think about that. So philosophers try to think about how all things, hang together. We also analyze other people's attempt to unite things into such comprehensive wholes. Typically we, and not just the philosophers only, call those products or those comprehensive wholes worldviews. And we talk about and identify a scientific worldview, a Darwinian worldview, an ecological worldview, a biocentric, an ecocentric worldview, a humanistic worldview, a theistic, a naturalistic, a Marxistic worldview, a feministic worldview, and so on. Sometimes we think that these can be combined with one another, and the name we give to the worldview just identify what is taken to be perhaps the most central element in the worldview. Other times we think of them as competing worldviews, in that they exclude each other in important ways. So what is a worldview in this sense? A worldview is roughly a constellation of attitudes, beliefs, and values that people, consciously or unconsciously, hold, which are of relevance for the understanding who they really are, what the world is ultimately like, what their place in it is, what they should do to live a satisfying or good life, and what they can say, know, and rationally believe about these things. So what I said yesterday is that it's important that we understand that this is not, the worldviews can be given two meanings. The other meaning that I'm not thinking about here is when you kind of pile up all the scientific theories and you kind of say, yes, I believe in them. And you say, well, that's the scientific worldview. I'm thinking about not just the kind of theories, but it's also about the place, who we really are, how we should live a satisfying life, and what are the limits of knowledge and rational belief. So in a way you can say that a worldview relates at least two things. It regulates our ontology, what ultimately exists and how these things are related to one another, and also the epistemology, what we can know, rational, believe about these things. Now, one crucial part of people's worldview is their everyday life world, or common sense world. I'm thinking about our beliefs in our own existence, in other people, in animals, in plants, artwork, cars, restaurant, carpenters, teachers, odor, color, sound, music, that we can think and express different emotions, that we can talk to each other, that people could express their intentions, communicate through language, that we can do good and evil things, being selfish, unselfish, care about other people, ignore them, and so on. Now, these are the kind of things and properties that populate the world that we all unavoidably content with and care about. This is the world that we all encounter and interact with every day. Now, for some people, their everyday life world constitutes their whole worldview. But for most of us living in the Western world today, it only constitutes a central part of our total worldview. For most of us, the natural sciences also leaves an important contribution to our worldview. They tell us, to simplify and just taking, well, not quite out of the blue, but anyway, that the universe came into existence through a Big Bang 15 million years ago or so, and that the Earth is one planet among several that moves in an ellipse around the Sun in our galaxy, which is one in a huge number of galaxies. There are laws of nature, that life evolved out of primitive soup of matter through evolution, that all living things on Earth belong to the same tree of life, and so forth. Now, for some of us, this, and not much more, is the contribution of the natural sciences to our worldview. For the other, these sciences gives a much larger and richer contribution. Now, besides the research we have on nature, we also have research on society and culture. So for most of us, the humanities, very broadly conceived. So I'm just, not to make things too complicated, I will just talk about the natural sciences, humanities. And if you like to put some parts of the social sciences in the natural science, that's fine, put the rest in the humanities. And it's no disrespect for the social sciences. I'm just going to deal with two things here to make it a little bit easier. So for most of us, also the humanities, in very broadly conceived, gives an important contribution to our worldview. They tell us that there has been many civilizations in human history, that an important empire in Europe for a long time was the Roman Empire, that despite the existence of different languages, it's possible to detect a grammatical structure in all languages, that there are different forms of governments, that different countries have different legal systems, that there are different theories about justice, and there are different kinds of processes going on in the world that has to do with modernization, globalization, and secularization, and so forth. For some of us, this, and not much more, is the contribution of the humanities to our worldview. For others, they give a much larger and richer contribution. Now, when it comes to the relationship between these three things, everyday life world, the natural science, and the humanities, many of us think, oh, here it is. Many of us think, or just assume, that even if they sometimes certainly can come in conflict with each other, they all leave an important contribution to our worldview. We basically have what we call a complementary understanding of these parts of our worldview. One way of expressing this complementary view would be to say that the natural sciences and the humanities do not tell us what exists, but tells us what else exists besides those things and properties we already know exist. So for instance, I know I had breakfast this morning, that it tasted good, and that's one of the good things of staying at a hotel, that it's a really nice breakfast. And I know that breakfasts are part of the furniture of the world. And I don't need the natural science, and I don't need the humanities to know these things. I need them to tell me what else exists beside those things and properties. On this account, the natural sciences and the humanities gives us theories which explain or help us understand things that are not directly accessible to us in our everyday life world. Now, it's important to realize that not all of us share such an essentially, I mean they come in conflict with each other, so such an essentially complementary view of the relationship between our everyday life world, the natural sciences and the humanities. A competitive or conflict view would say that even if our everyday life, the natural sciences and the humanities sometimes can be in harmony with each other, there is a far-reaching conflict between what is held to be true in these parts of our worldview. And we can see scientism from this perspective. As a kind of rejection of the complementary view and instead as an advocacy of a conflict view. Or that is not quite right, I think. Maybe we should say that we should see scientism as a science priority view or a science default view, which has an attitude of skepticism toward these two other elements of people's worldview. And this follows since the advocates of scientism, scienticizers that I call them, or just science believers, say things like this. And I went through them yesterday, but here you have a kind of short version of what at least some of the key forms of scientism is. They say this follows from their perspective because they say science is the only way to understand the real world. Or, like Rosenberg says, being scientistic, not scientific, being scientistic, just means treating science as our exclusive guide to reality, to nature, both our own nature and everything else. Now, since science is the arbiter of all reality, or at least all knowable reality, and since it is our exclusive guide to reality, a scienticizer or science believer will adopt an attitude of skepticism, at least initially, against the other two elements of people's worldviews. If these other two domains, if they can be justified by scientific methods, they're okay. If not, we should drop them like hot potatoes. In other words, and as I pointed out in my previous lecture, scienticizers, or scientific expansionists, that's another term that I used, thinking about science as a kind of expansions of the boundaries of the natural sciences, way out, so to say. Or, depending on how strong or weak form of scientism you embrace, how far out those borders would go, is that you have two kind of strategies here. Either you have to transform everyday life or the humanities into science, or you have to explain it away and say that it hasn't really any bearing. The exclusive guide we have to reality is the natural sciences. Again, so this means that either the elements of everyday life or the humanities can be transformed through a process of scientization and thus become a part of the furnitures of the world that the natural sciences can discover and explain, or they must be rejected as an illusion. So let me again, I talked about this yesterday, but let me again exemplify this. So if they would go for the elimination strategy, maybe it will look like this. And we're talking about yourself here, you yourself. So Westerhoff writes like this: many of our core beliefs about ourselves do not withstand scientific scrutiny. This presents a tremendous challenge for our everyday view of ourselves, right? We're back to everyday here. As it suggests that in a very fundamental way, we are not real. Instead, our self is comparable to an illusion, but without anybody there that experienced the illusion. This sounds like the natural scientists have looked all over and they cannot find the self. And presumably, since there is nothing wrong with their methods, in that there is some essential limitation to their methods when it comes to this kind of question, the conclusion is that we, ourselves, do not really exist. Let me now offer some critical remarks here. I'll add some more eventually. But we never walk into a room and say, hey, there's a thought about problems with scientism. I wonder if it's my thought. If it's my thought, I know it, and I know that it belonged to myself. I know that I'm real, I know that I have real thoughts. Now, the humanities, through philosophy, have identified a different way of knowing than knowing things than using the microscopes of the sciences to identify the self. It's called introspection, reflection on our mental life. It's about the act of looking within oneself to get to know what it's like to be Mikael Stenmark, to be that particular self. That is, seeing yourself from a first-person perspective and not, like the sciences tend to do, from a third-person perspective. But, and this is the important thing, but if the natural sciences gives us the only kind of knowledge we can have, then there are no introspective knowledge. And since there are no introspective knowledge, we have no way of identifying ourselves. Now to a second example of the elimination strategy, and it has to do with humanities. This is Rosenberg. He says like this: there's only one way to acquire knowledge, and science way it is. That's the scientism, right? The research program this ideology imposes has no room for purpose, for meaning, for value, or stories. It cannot therefore accommodate the humanities as disciplines of inquiry, domains of knowledge. The humanities are a scientific dead end. When it comes to real understanding, the humanities are nothing we have to take seriously, except as symptoms. His idea is that things like purpose, meaning, and stories cannot really be located in the world of the natural sciences. They resist scientization. Therefore, they are an illusion. And since they play such a crucial role within the humanities have to go as well. Or perhaps he suggests the humanities, after all, are important, but in other ways. Perhaps some kind of academic entertainment, and can for this reason still be a part of the academy. So a remarkable gap has opened up between our everyday life world that most of us just take completely for granted, and the humanities on the one hand, and the scientistic, not the scientific, the scientistic worldview some very influential people seem to accept on the other hand. But that's just half of the story, because scienticizers or science believers or scientific expansionists can disagree on these issues, and I touched on that yesterday too. This is so since when something does not appear to be part of the natural sciences or within its scope, so to say, they could, instead of going for the elimination strategy, go for the scientization strategy. Maybe this is difficult with the self, but it might work in other areas like the humanities. So whereas Rosenberg wants to dump the humanities, Wilson, Edward O. Wilson, I also talked about him yesterday, likes to save it. He wants to find a way to incorporate the humanities into the scientific worldview. This is one place where he's talking about this. The only way to establish or to refute reconciliation between the natural sciences and the humanities is by the methods developed by the natural sciences, right? So don't get things wrong here. It's the natural sciences methods that we start out with. And that's the only way to go. Now, this idea's best support is no more than an extrapolation of the consistent past success of the natural sciences. This is what I called yesterday the great success argument of modern science. And then he ends, its surest test will be its effectiveness in the social sciences and humanities. Right, and that's also kind of a little strange, right? I mean, why, if the natural sciences wouldn't succeed in the scientization process of the humanities and social sciences, why would that be a problem for the great success of science? Science is very good. It's just when you think that it must cover the whole reality that you have problems. Now, more recently, Steven Pinker have developed and argue for the same kind or a similar kind of view. And here it says. He says like this: humanities are the domain in which the intrusion of science has produced the strongest recoil. Yet it's just that domain that would seem to be most in need of an infusion of new ideas. A consilience with science offered the humanities countless possibilities for innovation and understanding. The humanities would enjoy more of the explanatory depth of the sciences. So there's kind of shallow explanations in the humanities, but we can eventually get really deep explanations. Now, why is this scientistic? Well, I hinted at it already, but let's proceed on this. It is because it is not enough for Wilson and Pinker that humanities recognize and respect the sciences and are interested in learning things from the sciences. Rather, the idea is that the humanities need to submit to the sciences and be subsumed by them. It is not about summon the humanities to recover their greatness and their pride, or foster an exchange of ideas that can go both ways. Instead, they summon the humanities to a process of scientization. If you look at one response to Pinker, and this is an interesting discussion going on in the New Republic, so you just get on to it online and read it. It's quite interesting. But if you look at one response to Pinker, we can start to see another problem with scientists than what I've already hinted at. And this is Leon Wieseltier's response. and I'll try to comment on it. Pinker's essay, the one I quoted from, opens with the absurd but immensely revealing connotations that Spinoza, Locke, Hume, and Rousseau, Kant, and Smith were scientists. Now, the problem here is that these people didn't quite think about themselves as scientists. So it kind of seems to go against their self-understanding. They did a little science, but most things they did was something else, and if they're reminded for anything, it's this else. But there is perhaps one way out here. Perhaps one can be a scientist without being aware that one is a scientist. Now, what else could these thinkers have been for Pinker? If they contributed to knowledge, they must have been scientists. Because what other types of knowledge is there? So, as soon as you admit that people like these, famous philosophers mainly, but not only, offer an important contribution to our understanding of the world, you open up for the possibility that you don't need science to know things. If you don't want to go in that way, you have to make them, it seems, into scientists, even though they not are themselves aware of it. Or you have to deny that they have any essential contribution to give to the understanding of the world. So that's another problem that you run into here. So let me go on and add another problem that I see with this scientific project. I think scienticizer obscure or distort a crucial distinction, a crucial scientific distinction between methodological and ontological reduction. And this is how I would phrase it. Logically reduce an object of study to merely one thing or one kind of thing if we do so in order to study it with certain methods. We ontologically reduce an object of study when we say or assume that it's nothing but or nothing more than what we can discover with the methods we are using. And this is a method I think we all use, whether we are in the humanities or natural sciences. And so it's an important thing to do. And I talked a little bit yesterday, at some point, I remember when, about me as a philosopher of religion. As a philosopher of religion, I work basically with analytical philosophical methods. There are other philosophical methods, but those are the ones I work with. And if you work with those kinds of methods and you apply them to religion, you kind of just get beliefs or propositions and things like that. And that's quite okay as a philosopher of religion to reduce methodological religion to a set of beliefs. It's not a problem as such, because you do have to do certain reductions to be able to apply certain methods. But that wouldn't allow me to say, well, religion is nothing more than a set of beliefs, to go from a methodological reduction to an ontological one. And that is, I think, one of the crucial problems we run into when we have a scientific attitude, that we kind of jump over or think it's justified to go from the methodological to the ontological reduction. And I'll give you a classic example of this. This is the famous Nobel Prize winner in biology, Francis Crick, and his scientific worldview. He's writing like this: the astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. This hypothesis is so alien to the ideas of most people alive today that it can truly be called astonishing. Now, it's not a problem, I think, here that using the kind of methods he's using, that he discovered that human beings are a pack of neurons, right? But I don't see how you can from that come to the conclusion that we're nothing but a pack of neurons. That is to going from a methodological reduction to an ontological reduction. But maybe there is no reason to say, well, hey, oh yeah, it's a mistake, but there is just nothing more to human beings. And therefore, I just wanted to also entertain how things would look from the angle of the humanities and a humanistic worldview. If you hold such a view, you would say, well, the picture Crick gives us, that's what we look like from a purely natural science perspective. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as we understand the limits of the natural sciences. But we can also reflect about values such as democracy, justice, freedom, and truth, and about the importance we should give them in our lives. We can let these values influence how we choose to live our lives. We can create art, music, literature, even natural science. We might even have a free will, or at least we can reason rationally, or at least sometimes. We can, it seems, choose whether we should think that Crick's view of us is reasonable or not, whether there are good reason that counts for and against a scientific worldview. We are self-conscious, reflective, critically, and evaluative creatures, besides being a collection of neurons. And much of this more is inaccessible to the method of the natural sciences. And perhaps this is what's really astonishing about us human beings, that we can live a life driven by the kind of values we hold on to. But then again, we're back to an essentially complementary view of the relationship between our everyday life world, the natural sciences, and humanities. Let me end with a third problem I think scientism faces, and it's actually, I would say, my deepest personal worry about scientism. I think the deepest problem has to do with the natural sciences are not particularly helpful. In fact, they could rather be destructive when it comes to knowledge and understanding of interpersonal relationship. The knowledge we get when we treat other as a you or as an I. To see this, think about the stereotypical scientist made fun of in comedies on TV, who has limited understanding of complex social relationships among people, and merely sees people as you would see things if your only resources were the pronouncements of science and mathematics, treating them as objects and lacking the means to take into account that they are subjects too, and who therefore lack an essential body of knowledge to navigate the social world. They lack a great deal of personal or interpersonal knowledge. Of course, most scientists aren't like the stereotype. But they are not like the stereotype because in their social life, whether or not they are aware of it, they rely on other means to obtain knowledge than those offered by the natural sciences. So what deeply worries me is that scientism seems to imply that this stereotypical scientist should actually be our norm, and it gives us a recommendation that the political leaders of the world should listen merely to him. And yes, the stereotype is male. Since genuine knowledge cannot really be found anywhere else than in the natural sciences. And this is deeply problematic, at least in my view, and it's a worry that I have. So for these reasons, among others, I think that we should embrace an essentially complementary view of the relationship between our everyday life world, the natural sciences, and the humanities, rather than accepting a science default or a science priority view as scientism exemplified. So in the end, or at the end of the day, I actually think that we should, well, it's not a surprise, I think we should reject scientism. Thank you.